Hello, GRCSU, and welcome to another Coffee with Coaches. And as you can see, we have another super special guest with us. We love having guests. Email us if you would like to be a guest because it's really a lot of fun. So welcome, Lisa Mattison.
Hi, everybody. How are you today?
Good.
Good. I am super excited to talk about SBAC interim assessments today. This is going to be like interim assessments 101. So if you are already giving interim assessments and using interim assessments, hit pause, go take care of something you need to, and tune in for a second part of this presentation that we'll do sometime after break, which is really around using the data, running the reports, like a little more in-depth analysis. This is really like the intro to if you have never used an SBAC interim or you've only used it once and you really want to get a little bit more information about what they are, why we use them, and some basic resources around how to access them and the resources that are available through them. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm just going to jump in and share my screen if that's okay. Okay. Okay, so I think everybody can see me now. We're going to link this in the newsletter too, so that you can have access to these slides. There's a lot of links embedded in them. So in next week's newsletter, those will go out and you'll be able to just click directly on them instead of having to find them on your own. And I tried to make this kind of like a self-guided piece. So we won't get to everything in it today, but if you have time and you want to go through it on your own, then you can just move through it and it's kind of self-explanatory. So I want to start with what are SBAC interims. So we know we administer the SBAC performance test every spring, and that is grades 3 through 8 and 11 administered by the state. It's a national test. And what the SBAC interims are there smaller tests that we can administer on our own that are based on the same research and validation and question formatting as the SBAC assessment. So they're linked to content directly, and there's two different types. There's an interim assessment block, or an IAB, and this is what we really recommend people look at and use throughout GRCSU. And there's two types of IABs, actually, the block tests. One is a little bit longer. It has a little over a dozen targets, learning targets that it's assessing, and 20 questions-ish for students. And that gives you kind of a snapshot on a broad focused area of content. But what they came out with last year for the first time, which is really exciting, is something they call focused IABs. And those are a much more targeted assessment. So they're really looking at, anywhere from 1 to 3 learning targets. So you can really tailor that to exactly the content that you're teaching in your class and use this as an additional assessment tool that gives you a different lens on student performance based on those very specific targets. A lot of teachers use these along with their curriculum unit post-test. So as part 1 of your post-test would be your curriculum-based measure that you're using in your classroom. When you finish that and turn it in, log in, take your SBAC interim on the same content, and it gives a teacher 2 different points of reference for how students are performing with mastery or proficiency at that point in those learning targets. There are a couple links on this first slide I want to point out. The first is the link to the interim overview, and that is, I'm not presenting, am I? Let me try that, then you can see it. It'll be a little larger for you. So the link to the interim overview, this really gives you just the overview. What are interims, how to find them, and in that document is also a list of every single block that you can give or comprehensive assessment you can give. So you can use that document to figure out what would be appropriate for your grade level and content area. And then the second document or link down here is to the Tools for Teachers website, which is part of the SBAC connection. And this is something that's really cool about SBAC Interims, and one of the reasons why I think they're really useful for teachers. When you give an SBAC interim and you get your student data back, it actually automatically connects you with resources to help you with instruction for reteaching or extending or whatever it is that you need to do for students based on their data. So the Tools for Teachers website that's linked here is all of the data, but once you administer an interim, it will give you a connections playlist, that's what they call it, and that's a targeted list of instructional resources for you based on your students' performance on this assessment. They've been curated by teachers all over the country, and so folks just like you who really vetted those resources and made sure they were worth looking at. So just something simpler, you know, when our students are struggling or we're getting data that says they need support in something, a lot of times we're trying to find and research curriculum materials and instructional resources. It can take a lot of time, you know, you go down the Google rabbit hole and somehow always wind up on Teachers Pay Teachers. But this is a different set of resources, in that it's already, other teachers have already taken the time to do that and have pulled these things together and said, these are worth your time to look at. The second kind of Smarter Balance interim is called a comprehensive assessment. This is not something we're recommending. It's like a full-length practice test for SBAC. And we really don't want to do that in a general sense, because we're not trying to get our kids to practice taking the SBAC. Like, that's not something we need to have them do. The only time that you might want to use that is if you had a kid who moved in from a different state and they didn't give SBAC assessments. And so you didn't have kind of any standardized assessment data as a school that could help you compare that student to the rest of your student population. You might want to administer those in the fall to that student to just kind of get a snapshot of where they are, especially if they're at an upper grade level and you really have to worry about graduation requirements and proficiencies. That might really help you with that piece, but otherwise we don't recommend that piece. However, there is one piece of the comprehensive assessments that we do recommend, and that is the performance tasks. These traditionally are something that our students really struggle with when they take the SBAC. It's a place where their scores tend to be on the lower side in comparison to their overall achievement, because performance tasks are a little more complex. They require higher order thinking, application of skills. Students have to kind of independently navigate a situation, an experience, or multiple resources and put that all together in an open response piece. And so practice with that kind of performance task can be huge. And again, it's just a great resource for you. And when you're thinking about developing your own classroom-based assessments, if you're trying to make performance tasks for kids, these give you some great examples of how to structure those performance tasks in a way to really engage deep student thinking and work in that piece. So I'm going to pause here for 1 second and see if anybody has questions about anything that I said so far. Just what are the interims? Why would you want to give them? Okay, I'm going to keep going. Okay.
Good.
We went over a lot of this already. The one piece I didn't highlight is SBAC really has great features and tools. And when we take the SBAC at the end of the year, we never get to see the questions and the answer choices. That makes it really hard because we can't do an item analysis with that assessment, and we can't really learn from it what we really want to know about where students struggled, why they made the mistakes that they made. You know, is it a question format? Is it a gap in understanding? Is it a reading comprehension issue? We don't have that level of access to the official SBAC test to learn those things. But with the SBAC interims, that's completely the opposite. We have access to every single question, every single answer choice, and the data comes back and it actually gives you like an itemized analysis so you know for every student which answer choice did they pick, and for your class as a whole, you know, how many of them chose A, how many of them chose B, how many of them chose C, how many of them chose D. So you can look at close confusers, you can look at wording and language, you can really get an understanding of text complexity, question complexity. lots of different things that you can see. And the teachers that I've worked with in the past who have used SBAC Interim have used that information to then go back and look at how they're asking questions on their own assessments and to revise their own curriculum-based assessments so that they are a little bit higher rigor, a little more synthesis, a little more application. When you get into the interims and you look at the questions, you'll see they're differently structured from how we normally ask kids to demonstrate mastery. And that, but it's in a good way. It really shows student thinking and chips away at their level of understanding. And if they really, really own content and can, or skills and can apply them. So just a great tool to be able to look at those questions and answers. Who can use these? All students who take SBAC can use these. The one caveat to that is if you have students who take the ALT assessment instead of SBAC, then they wouldn't take SBAC interims either. It wouldn't be appropriate in general. Your team might look at them to make that determination on an individual basis and see what they think about the interim, but in general, you're going to make that call. Also, the same modifications and accommodations that you can, or the embedded and non-embedded accommodations that can be programmed through the SBAC system for the test in May can also be used for the interims. And you want to do that. You want to make sure that if you're going to try and give a student an accommodation or modification on SBAC at the end of the year, that they have that accommodation all year long on all of the assessments that they're taking, including SBAC interims. So the same process is how we go into SBAC in the spring and set up those accommodations. Your school-based team, often your case manager, your administrator, is responsible for setting up those accommodations in the SBAC system. You want to make sure that those go in as well for students at the beginning of the year before they start taking interims. In addition, all of your IABs have what SBAC calls blueprints. And what they mean by blueprint is it actually tells you exactly what standards are being assessed on SBAC, how many questions there are being asked for every single standard, how many questions overall. You can really understand how these tests are made, where the alignment to the Common Core is, where the alignment to your selected proficiencies is. You can also see if they're not aligned. So if what we're focused on for your curriculum is not aligned with what's being assessed on the SBAC test, then that tells us that we're missing a piece that everyone teaching the Common Core has identified as something important, and we should continue to look at that. But great blueprints if you're thinking about curriculum mapping, how you prioritize, how you spend your time over the course of the school year, and you want to make sure that that's aligned with how students are being assessed. The blueprints are a really great tool. How do you administer them? You go into the same online login system that you go into to administer SBAC at the end of the year. And I put in links to 2 guides here, how to activate a test session for interim assessments. And also, if you have a student who's a remote learner and you're going to administer an interim to them remotely, they came up with separate guidance for that this year, so you can see how to make that work. And just a friendly reminder that you have to do that 30-minute recorded PowerPoint interactive every year before they let you log on to the system. So you just want to make sure that you have that done in advance of the first time that you want to give an interim. How do you get data and use it from the interims? I put in a user guide here for the assessment viewing application. That's the place where you can actually go in and see the data. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. It's not a terrible data system, probably not as complicated as signing up for COVID testing, which many of us have done and struggled with. This seems to be much easier to use than that system. But there are a couple tricks and tips that are in that assessment viewing guide that you might want to take a look at. This reporting system user guide, though, that's my favorite resource. What that does is it literally walks you through with like picture step, click the button, click this, click that, click this, click that, guidance on what reports are available, what each of the reports shows you for data, how to dig down into the reports. So like click, 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 kind of like the map interface when you get into that data, that there's so many levels of detail. You can look at your class level, you can look at student levels, you can look at standard levels, you can look at target levels. You can really sort and filter this data in ways that makes it so easy for you to plan for instruction, because you can see how would you group kids as a result of this assessment data. What did you learn about them, and what you need to go back and either reteach, or where can you extend for students who are ready to kind of get pushed to that advanced level in their work. The beginning of the guide is less useful. I said start on page 17. I think that's really where it gets super useful, but cannot say enough about that resource. I think that it's a really, really good one. And I see that there's a question. Vermont SBAC is now 3 through 9, not 3 through 8 and 11 now, right? Oh, that's from Al. Al, that's honestly a great question, and I haven't looked at it since last year because, of course, we canceled SBAC, so I have not gone in and looked at that. But we'll get clarification out to everybody on that before it's time. I know the second question everybody's asking is, are we going to have SBAC this year? I'll just pause for a moment and say we don't know yet. The state actually just sent out a memo about it yesterday. They are working on a waiver to the federal government for the ESSA requirements around SBAC. They're trying to figure out what makes the most sense. In particular for remote learners, that seems to be the trick, and that the assessment is not really designed to be administered to remote learners. So there's a lot of conversation about that. So bottom line is we don't know yet, but as soon as we do, we will make sure that everybody knows, so you can plan for this year. But SBAC interims are already up, live, ready to go, loaded on the website. All our kids are in the system. They've been rostered. So you should have full access to that. And if you have any problems, reach out to your instructional coach or TAC, Greg, and we can make sure that that gets up and running for you. So one more piece here for performance tasks. Again, the things that I think just such useful resources here. They've got scoring guides and writing rubrics that there are actually the ones that are used on SBAC to score the SBAC test. And so you can log in and you can download, right here on these links, you can download the scoring guides and the writing rubrics, and you can compare them to how are you scoring work in your own classroom. And if your performance tasks are being scored very differently than the way that the SBAC performance tasks are, then that's not helping your kids to be prepared for how they're, again, ultimately going to be assessed. And knowing too that SBAC is also aligned with the SAT and the formatting of the SAT. So it's not just about SBAC for our scores, it's also about helping kids be prepared for other opportunities in life, and making sure that they have kind of that piece in place too. And just the rigor, they're really, we see, that's what we keep coming back to over and over again, that the rigor of SBAC is higher in general than how we are assessing children in our classrooms. And that's why we see a gap between our internal curriculum-based measures, our classroom tests, and student scores on SBAC. So these tools, scoring guides, writing rubrics, that's really going to help you see and analyze how they are the same or different from the work that kids are already doing in your classroom. Where can we find more resources? There are tons. I put in a whole bunch of links here. The Smarter Balance website, they have a resources for educators website. They made a back to school assessment playbook for this year. The AOE has curated a whole bunch of resources for Vermont educators, and that's in their portal. There are practice tests and sample questions that are available. Even if you don't administer an interim to students and you're not ready to take that step yet, you can always go on and you can look at the practice tests and the sample questions yourself as a teacher and do that curriculum and assessment analysis yourself while you get ready to administer interims. Those blueprints I talked about that show the whole test, they have those for the full SBAC as well as the interims. So you can go on and look at what is actually going to be assessed on the full length SBAC in the spring. And I'm going to stop there for questions again.
One kind of a question that I hear a lot from teachers when I get to talking about tests and this sort of thing is, isn't this in some way teaching to a test? And I don't necessarily feel that way, but I'd like to know how you respond to.
Yeah, well, and that's
that,
where I
how you
talked about
answer
the comprehensive assessment, the ICAs versus the interim assessment blocks. Because I do think if you're giving the full length practice test, those ICAs, that is like, to me, that's teaching to the test. We're spending time assessing kids on a full length practice test. That doesn't necessarily inform our teaching tomorrow. And that's really what we want to do. But these interim blocks, they really should be right embedded with your assessments that you're doing in the classroom. And you know, in part, it's really hard to develop high quality assessments as a teacher. You know, we rely a lot of times on a pre-published curriculum series, and we give the chapter test at the end of the chapter. But when you sit down, and especially in your PLC group, and you really look at the rigor of the questions on those assessments, in general, they're really low level on a Bloom's taxonomy. They'll recall, you know, that kind of level. But when you look at the level of questioning on these SBAC interims, you see that it's a much higher level. It's synthesis, evaluation, application, like integration in particular of multiple standards at one time, which we also rarely do on our own assessments. That's a much higher level, and that's where we want our kids to be. We really want them to be thinkers and owners of knowledge and skill and able to use it in a wide variety of circumstances. It's the whole point of education. It's not that they learn it for now, it's that they know it when they have a job or they're out in the real world or they're, you know, sitting at home trying to figure out how much carpet to order for their living room when they want to redo the floor. Like, these are skills. So far beyond teaching to the test, I truly think this is a great way for us to reflect on and improve the rigor of our own assessments by looking at this as a model for what rigorous assessment really looks like.
Yeah. I know that the consortium that put these together, they had representatives from industry and college level people as well.
Yeah.
And a big part of what they were doing was trying to address issues that they saw of, you know, students, they've come out of high school, now they're ready to enter the workforce or college, and they were just missing certain skills that they needed them to have.
Yep.
So that's part of why there's so much rigor in the design of these tests.
Yeah, I mean, and these are used by like 30 something states across the country, huge stakeholder involvement in their development, and they're updated constantly. So, you know, they have way more resources in developing assessments than, you know, I did as a middle school teacher sitting alone in my living room at 7 o'clock at night. So just a great tool to be able to use.
So Lisa, what advice would you give to, typically it would just be third grade teachers, but this year it's third and fourth grade teachers who have students who have never experienced not only the SBAC, but any sort of test like this. You know, I think we view interims as sort of like practice tests, but I think they're more than that. So how can we prepare our students to take an interim the first time?
Absolutely. So, I mean, you can, the way the interims are phrased, you can use them however you want. So you could pull up a focused block interim with those, you know, 1 to 3 learning targets, and you could do it together as a class. You could put it up on the projector and go through together and talk through the answer choices and use it for modeling. You know, I mean, you have free access to this content. So, or you could go on and look at practice questions and sample questions, and you could download a few sample questions and use them as do-nows with your class. You could have kids work on them together in collaborative pairs and talk through the answers together and the formatting. SBAC also built right into their system. They do have a practice test module for third graders usually, but this year third graders and fourth graders, that actually like is a training test and teaches them about the tools in SBAC, the systems in SBAC, how they can log on, what they can do, what happens when they click certain buttons. And that's a great tool. It doesn't take very long, maybe half an hour max. We usually recommend that third and fourth grade teachers give it to their students just before the SBAC test, but you could certainly give it to them before you start doing interims as well. And when you log on to the SBAC portal, once you've finished that 30-minute training video, you have access to that and you can administer it at any time.
So I've seen a teacher have like these little half sheet pieces of paper that in the morning, as like a brain warm up or a morning seat work sort of idea, with questions that are based on the math questions, especially on the SBAC. Is that something that came from that, or did she create those herself?
Yeah, I think if it was the same teacher that I'm thinking of, what she saw, she administered an interim and saw that her students had performed poorly on 4 questions. And when she went in and she looked at those 4 questions, all 4 of them were formatted exactly the same way. And so the questions basically had different content, but they were asked the same way. So she was able to take the format of that question and turn it into a daily warm-up or a daily do now with her students, where she just put in whatever content they were working on in their curriculum, but the formatting was the same. And in that case, it was a negative. So which one of these is not a possible solution to this problem kind of question? And we know that especially our younger students, they really struggle with that. They miss the not piece, and they just answer it. But again, that's critical analysis. Like, they have to be able to comprehend what is being asked of them to answer a question correctly. Just like in any other situation, like, they need to be able to filter out what is not relevant just as often as they need to be able to figure out what is relevant. So great skills there. But yeah, you could use, they're so flexible, they're wide open, it's open source content. So you can go in and you can use it however you think will work with your class. I know we just have a couple more minutes left, so I just wanted to quickly go to a few more things. I think eventually we'll try and turn these into modules, or some of these into modules, because there's some really great resources. But if you're waiting and you're ready to go and you don't want to wait for the module to come out, here are some recommended next steps that I think would be great. So, and I just listed there's 2 slides worth of them, and I'm not going to go through all of them in the time that we have left. But again, just some suggestions for how do you take this now that you've heard about interims, you're starting to think about them a little bit more. What can you do to expand and deepen your own knowledge and practice in this area, and get ready to use them in your class or use them to amp up the curriculum and assessment that you're already using. So I just want to let people know that those are there as well. And that's it for my presentation today, unless there's any other questions that folks have.
No, thanks. That was a fantastic first look.
That was
great resource.
Yeah, great. I love the SBAC Interims, in case you can't tell. I do. I think that we're so fortunate to have this kind of resource available, both for our students and for us as practitioners, and being able to enhance our own work by looking at this model. So I hope that that's useful and helpful. I'm always happy to answer any questions about it. Come work with you on it, look at your data with you, anything that I can do to help support SBAC Interims and you get into them in your classroom, just shoot me an email and I will connect with you and help you get that going in your classroom.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for a very detailed demonstration.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
Bye, everyone.